You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good, man. Just hunkering down, getting ready for the storm. I live in Augusta, Georgia. We are taking a direct hit. And what I think the news is here is that you now live in the South and are facing a direct hit from a hurricane. And this has got to be a first for you.
It absolutely is. We're talking about, what is it, Hurricane Ian, I think is the name. But yes, you sent me a picture last night. Like, hey, you're like in the path, like inland in Georgia. And I'm like next in line right after it hits you. Yeah, never been through a hurricane before. So we'll see how that goes. I live on the side of a mountain, so I'm not necessarily worried about flooding, more like storm damage, maybe if there's like high winds and trees and stuff like that. So
yeah, you're probably going to have a few trees go down. You'll probably get a lot of rain, but it's one of those deals like we've got a lot of nerve like complaining about it because maybe some of our grass will get washed out and other people are having their houses destroyed. But
how dare it?
Yeah, well,
the insolence of Hurricane Ian.
Yeah, for sure. So I had another thought recently. So you and I have known each other for a long time. In our glory days, we did strategic IAM advisory together. And I know you're familiar with the term stump the chump. And I'm wondering, what does stump the chump mean to you?
Well, I mean, you're basically asking hard questions, trying to stump whoever is on the spot trying to answer those questions.
Good answer.
For whatever reason. It's almost like, I don't know. I don't remember the name of the game, but it's kind of like you throw the football up in the air and then everyone tries to tackle that person, whoever catches it, and that person tries to run away. It's almost like tag, but a safer version of that, probably.
Yeah. No, but when you're in the moment, if you don't have a good answer, it doesn't feel good. But I'm wondering, have you ever received the stump the chump question of, it goes something like this: privileged access management, does it include social media accounts?
So this is one of my favorite questions because I have advocated that it does for years now. I think, if you historically kind of look at the space of privileged access management, it's been like, oh yeah, it's our server accounts, or it's like our database, or whatever it may be. And I've argued, I think, for the last couple of years. I know you know this because you and I have been in the same room. When we're talking with clients, it's like, okay, how about your social media accounts? How are you managing Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter? Whatever the TikTok, I guess now at this point would probably be one of the major ones. How are you protecting those accounts? Because those are absolutely privileged, and a lot of damage can be done, reputation wise, especially, if you have the wrong people posting. And I've worked for companies who have had that issue in the past. And it is something that is an unfortunate truth of the real world.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that one thing that the maturation of my thinking about social media accounts, of course, they're important because look at the results when something happens, when they're compromised. But I also think within the scope of the social media account is really like third-party applications. So in my experience, like almost every organization has a ton of third-party applications that they use. And by convenience or just because they don't have a better solution, they end up managing those passwords by sharing them, emailing them to each other, things like that. And it's obviously then you have all the same problems that you would run into from an IAM perspective with every other type of privilege access. How do you change it so that the person who left can't use it anymore?
Well, especially if you have like those OAuth tokens, right, that you probably granted like 10 years ago to like services and you just never cleared them out. I'm guilty of that, as my multiple devices and me testing out things all the time. I'm constantly having to go into, my identity providers and clear out old devices, Microsoft, Google, right, stuff like that. Android phone. Oh, that was last week. I'm on iPhone now, and then the next week it'll be different. So it's a similar, I think, problem is a lot of these services will give you that, that integration, and then you kind of forget about it. And it means something still has access to your account. You got to be careful.
Now, do you take, when you go from Android to iPhone and back, do you take the same SIM card? Are SIM cards able to go from phone to phone across platform?
Well, yes, you used to be able to do that. You typically can take your SIM and just swap it into a new phone, and then you log in with your credentials, and everything kind of comes download from the cloud. At least that's how I do it. I just do it so often. The new iPhone though has an eSIM, which means there's no longer a physical SIM, at least on US models. So now everyone who's on the new iPhone 14 is leveraging eSIM, which is probably the future. I am a little concerned about me liking to switch devices, so I don't know what that means. I'm going to try out, my an Android phone here at some point. If I want, I can't just swap my SIM card into it, so that's something I've got to kind of read up on. But it seems like US iPhone users who have the new 14 are going to experience the joys of eSIM for
Oh,
the
that'll
first
be
time,
interesting.
even though it's a standard that's been around for a
Yeah,
little
next
while.
time we get Roger Grimes on the show, we'll have to ask him about the eSIM and does this open up new opportunity for SIM swapping attacks?
It's supposed to reduce it to some degree because I don't want to claim that it reduces it, but I think it theoretically will help with it. It's funny you mentioned SIM swapping because Cloudflare just announced, I think it's Cloudflare, some service around eSIM and being able to kind of track and help secure that from like an MDM perspective. I don't know how good it is. It's definitely not a plug for them, but it happened to kind of come across my feed in the last couple of days, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
to hear
you
about
always
that.
want to keep an eye on that news coming across. I mean, elsewhere in the news, my birthday is October 4th. You're celebrating my birthday by going to Austin and the SailPoint Navigate conference and leaving me behind. I do love a good Tex-Mex. The food trucks. That's like my thing. But I'm glad for you that you're going. And honestly, on my birthday, I probably actually wouldn't want to go on a business trip.
Yeah, you're probably right. So you're welcome. I'll take the hit on that one. First time going to SailPoint Navigate, so it'll be interesting. I'm sure I'll see a bunch of familiar faces and kind of connect with old identity friends and things like that. But yeah, it'll be interesting. So I'll be by the time people are listening to this, I'll be in Austin at SailPoint Navigate that week, and then you and I are going to the Authenticate 2022 conference in Seattle, put on by the FIDO Alliance. That's the week of October 17th, and we're hoping to put together some good content there, similar to what we did for Gartner with recording with some guests and putting out a bunch of shows. I'm not sure if we'll have 2 full weeks worth. That was a lot, but we should have more than a handful of episodes to put out in a timely manner, hopefully around that time.
It'd be good to be able to actually sit through some of the sessions because they look really interesting. And but I do think we're going to wind up having quite a few episodes because it's too good of an opportunity to connect with all those people who are speaking. I guess last but not least, we're going to Octane in San Francisco. That's the week of November 7th. Again, we're hoping to get our podcast on and meet with a bunch of people who are going to be at the conference.
That'll be my first Octane too. So it's a little bit different kind of leading a practice, doing more of the business development partnership stuff. But I'm enjoying it. I think it's a cool opportunity. So it's going to be fun. And it's funny you bring up the ability to meet things. So today we're going to, I guess, let's just pivot, right? Let's just get right into our sort of topic du jour. And we led off with the social media conversation around accounts and kind of managing access. And that's really what we're going to talk about for the most part today is managing social media account access, right? Shared accounts or maybe delegated administration, sort of things like that. And the individual we're going to have on here, I was not able to meet at Gartner because you had me stuck in a sweet, as you like to say, Jim, editing podcasts. But you guys are able to connect there. And I'm hopeful that we'll connect at Octane. But he is certainly an individual passionate about shared passwords. We've got Kurt Greening with Serby. Welcome to the show, Kurt.
Thanks for the invite. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So we have tradition around here. The first time anyone joins us for the first time is we like to find a little bit out about their identity background or maybe their InfoSec background. And really kind of find out, how did you get into this space? Is this something that you chose or did it choose you?
That's a great question. So I started my career trying to take a CD-ROM server and put it on a network. So first the Novell network, later Active Directory. After that, I played around with Microsoft Exchange and hated backup and recovery of Microsoft Exchange. And so the desire to get Exchange online is really, migrating to Office 365. That's what got me really into identity. So I had to learn a little bit about something called Active Directory Federation Services at first, and later Azure Active Directory Premium. So that's really what got me more into identity.
Now,
So you're from the trenches, Jim. What were you going to say?
CD-ROM server. I mean, I've got to know more about the CD-ROM server. Lay it on us.
Yeah. So back in the day, if you were a supply sergeant in the military, one of the biggest use cases was you had from the Defense Logistics Agency national stock numbers, and everything that you ordered from boots to sleeping bags were in this national stock number catalog. And so military really needed to have these CD-ROM servers, and the supply sergeants wanted to start putting them on networks. So that's what got me into Novell first and Active Directory after.
And now you're with Serby. I'll admit I'm not overly familiar with Serby. So when we first started to talk about this, that was interesting because I thought, okay, well here's potentially something that might solve some problems for some folks. I guess we don't want to turn this into a commercial for Serby, but give us a 30-second, maybe at most 60-second answer of what does Serby do?
So what Serby does is solve the challenge of applications that can't integrate with corporate single sign-on. Typically, that's because they don't support identity standards. I'm talking primarily about SAML and SCIM. And of course, challenges that we end up with is not knowing who has access to what, not having automated onboarding and offboarding. Certainly that's a challenge. And then who knows in those environments if password best practices are being followed.
So Kurt, the topic for today is social media accounts. And we all know that organizations face the challenge of managing social media accounts. And I think probably the biggest challenge is that they're accessed by more than one person. So what's the right way to manage and secure those?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the size of your organization. If you're a really small organization and one or two people are managing those, I think that there are some best practices that can be followed. Maybe using a password manager. My friend Matt Chiotti actually has a social media checklist of things that he recommends people do. So, I mean, if you're small, you can absolutely follow those best practices manually. If you start to get big and you have a big brand or you're advertising on social media, that's where you might want to start looking at, do you need some type of automation and central management?
Yeah, you talked to us, and when we were getting ready for the podcast, you talked to us a little bit about Matt and kind of his social media checklist. So we'll make sure that we put that link out to that in our show notes. So if people are interested in kind of taking a look. But you also kind of talked to me about something that I wasn't really aware, which is that, hey, there are different types of accounts when you look at this social media landscape. So you got the type like Twitter, which is essentially like a shared password. Then you've got the Facebooks and login and LinkedIn's of the world where you've got kind of a corporate account and people connect with I think it's like their personal accounts and somehow are allowed to administer or switch contacts into the corporate account. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you're correct. There are two access models that I primarily see out there from social media. So that's shared password. Twitter is absolutely a great example of that. And not only do you need to make sure that you understand what's going on from the shared password, but how are you going to share the mechanisms for multi-factor authentication? And then with things like Facebook and LinkedIn, the main concern is, how do I map a personal identity back to a corporate identity so that when Jeff or Jim leave RSM, how do we take away their access to Facebook Business Manager? And one, make sure they don't do anything bad, but two, take away the risk that if their personal account gets hacked, some kind of fraud happens with our ad spend accounts.
Well, you've done a good job, I think, of not selling your own book of business, and we do appreciate that. But I think at the same time, we do want to talk a little bit about the technology solution. So if you are like a mid-sized to a large enterprise and you've got maybe a couple of Twitter accounts and maybe you're a big media company or a sports league and you've got, a couple of accounts or one main account and multiple people have to be hitting it, have the ability to post to that account. Um, Talk to me a little bit about what technologies is out there to make it so that I can manage that in a better way. Treat that like the privilege access credentials that I think Jeff and I agree that they are.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're on an identity show. I imagine that the people listening believe that single sign on is probably the best security investment that anybody could make. And so, personally, my belief is all of those applications that are in use on a corporate network, even consumer grade applications like social media, should be integrated with single sign on. But I think I mentioned that the challenge or why people aren't doing that today is lack of standard support of sandalwood skim. I know many big companies have tried to pressure social media companies into supporting these things. And, I hear it's on the roadmap, but I also hear it gets delayed. How do you solve that challenge? There's a couple of bright guys that came up with an idea to use robotic process automation to create APIs where APIs don't exist. And then where APIs do exist to do things like rotate passwords or remove access, et cetera. Certainly, we want to use those APIs. But in some cases, the big challenge and why this has never been solved is not having an API. And I think the best answer I've ever seen is to use robotic process automation to create those.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's I wouldn't say that is the answer that first came to mind. I mean, the RPA makes a lot of sense though. And I'm kind of also thinking of more or less the traditional IAM tool. So you kind of mentioned single sign-on, but we've also got, privilege access management, IGA. I'm wondering if, like, for the IAM practitioners out there who this isn't the main problem they're trying to solve, but it's one of the use cases, can they leverage their investments in PAM, SSO, IGA, or is this like a new problem that requires a new tool, or is this somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And so, yes, there are some customers out there that happen to be using Survey that have decided that they don't want Survey, which is a cloud-based platform to store the secrets, and they want to store the secrets someplace else. So that could be a PAM solution, that could be an AWS as a secrets management solution. And most people that we have talked to, if they do have a PAM solution rolled out, they at least go through the thought process to evaluate, should we be using PAM to manage social media? But anybody who's actually tried that, they realize that the PAM solutions are missing a bunch of automations that are specific to social media. So certainly that's a challenge. And then I don't know if you've ever met anybody from marketing. They're not usually the most technical. So, although PAM solutions are incredible for administrators, I don't recommend them for a social media person.
I think it's kind of almost like the lowest common denominator at that point. If it's probably better than nothing, but the usability is probably suspect. I think at best, the way that I kind of think about it is if you are lucky enough, first of all, to have a dedicated PAM solution, then most likely just a simple password vault is probably all you're going to really kind of going to be able to get away with to store those credentials. It's no different really than somebody having like a shared password wallet like a LastPass or Bitwarden or anything like that. All you're really doing is kind of storing the ID and password in one spot, but you can't really do anything with it to head off potential concerns. It almost becomes like a race where someone has access to the social media credentials and they should no longer have access to it. you need to beat them to the punch to change the password and other sort of, claiming parameters around the account before something bad happens. So I can kind of see the low tech solution. The lowest tech is, well, it's on a sticky note, and you just kind of pass it around the office, which not good. And then maybe you digitize a sticky note and put it inside of a spreadsheet, or maybe in sort of a password vault or something like that. But I do think the RPA angle is interesting from a proactive measure, especially this idea of creating sort of leverage points from an API perspective to do some security, which I think it's what piques my interest when I started, to kind of read up and kind of see how this thing works. But I'm curious from your perspective, you've got to have some, horror stories around what some people might have done with, breached or misused credentials, maybe in the social media world. I certainly have a couple from prior engagements in my life that I probably am not at liberty to talk about, but the risk is real. And I'm curious if there's anything you could share from, what are some of those risks around getting hacked? We mentioned the reputation, but certainly there's other things that I'm not thinking of offhand here.
I mean, poor Disney, they've been hacked, I believe, twice in the last 12 months. One was Twitter. I think an Elon Musk impersonator took over their Twitter. The other one was posting, racial and homophobic slurs. So not great for the old image, right? That's a negative one. And brand risk, it's not easy to quantify exactly, but the bigger the brand, the bigger the risk, right? But there are some things that are easy to quantify, like ad spend fraud. So I'll give you the Facebook example. We have a customer that bought Serby after they had an employee leave. That employee still had access to Facebook and other business managers via their personal accounts. So nobody took away their access. Social media was hacked, and $100 million was spent fraudulently on those ad spend accounts. So that's pretty easy to quantify. So one of the things I typically talk to CISOs about, or identity and access management professionals who are saying, I don't know if this really should be in my domain. I usually say, well, have your GRC team just go ask and say, what's your daily spend limit on your ad spend credit accounts, right? And then I guess thirdly, the scariest one that I've seen was about 3 months ago, a Brazilian retailer Fast Shop. There was a combination of a ransomware attack and then taking over Twitter and publishing new customer data, I think hourly, until they paid the ransom. So that was it's kind of a scary combo attack, I guess.
So for people who aren't familiar with this ad spend fraud, can you kind of give us the 101 on what that is for people who maybe just haven't really had that exposure yet within the social media world?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of marketing via social media, right? I mean, I think everybody, has seen brand influencers and that type of thing. If you've got kids, right, everybody wants to be a YouTube star, right? Or Instagram or whatever, or I guess probably it's TikTok, yeah. Right? Yeah. But the idea of ad spend is typically boosting maybe your influencers, making more people see it, and so you have a credit line pretty much like you have a credit card, and that can be used to promote your stuff, or that can be used to waste your money.
So if let's say my account does get breached, what are some of the things that I can do to sort of mitigate, or I guess reduce, what are my next steps essentially? I don't know if you have insight into sort of like an incident management plan. Obviously we probably want to delete tweets that probably shouldn't be there, but what are there things that I can do sort of, or start think about to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully you've done a tabletop exercise on this, right? You have a plan in place. But yes, quickly deleting any of the comments is the best thing. But we know today that first thing that kids do is screenshot things and take videos of anything that's up there. So if it's, up there for 10 seconds, chances are it's replicated on 100 different social channels. So that's a negative. And, if you have a big brand, you better have a good PR agency, crisis management, be ready to reach out to all the different news stations with, an official statement. Hopefully you can quickly talk about, this is how it happened. This is what we're doing to be responsible, et cetera, right? That, nobody wants to buy from a company that they think, well, they didn't even try and they don't seem to care, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't condone blah, blah, blah. We're taking steps to secure. Right. I think if you've been in the business, you've probably seen a number of these sort of, breach emails or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to add to that also. I think that, the quick reaction might be, oh, we just need to go out and delete that tweet. Kurt, I'm kind of wondering what your perspective on that is. Is like, should you delete the tweet with the slurs, or do you leave it there and post an apology, or how do you see that getting handled?
Yeah, I've never seen anybody leave it there. But what I typically have seen is that there are screenshots and articles and on the news. So that's usually your chance to comment on what was there. But, my personal, I'm not a PR expert. I'm a security guy, but I would say delete it if you can as quickly as possible.
Own it, I guess, would be the other alternative. And I don't know many brands that would survive owning controversial content like that. One thing that I am always fascinated by is this concept of deep fakes. I love the idea for the memes that I can potentially generate, the animated GIFs that I could certainly get some friends with. But I think this is also an area where it is starting to sort of invade the internet at large and becoming much easier for people to do. I'm curious if you've seen things around that space, around some of the more advanced maybe types of either attacks or the results of some of the attacks, where maybe there's, I could think of like, a deep fake of a CEO doing things they're not supposed to be doing, right? And that gets posted. I'm curious if you have any experience with that.
Well, I haven't actually seen that happen in a corporate environment yet, but I am working with a big New York financial institution, and they have social media flagged as a risk exception, and they're have a goal by the end of the year to eliminate those risk exceptions. And, one of the risks that they certainly looked at is the management of their CEO's account. And if something like that was to be posted, a deep fake or something else, what they would expect the potential impact to be to their stock. And so, in the management of his account alone, that's where they see enormous risk to people potentially shorting the stock if something was to happen.
So, Kurt, we kind of kicked off, and I threw this thought out there, which was that social media accounts and third-party accounts, to me, they have a very similar use case in that usually there's a small number of accounts, small number of users, and it's something that IT departments traditionally said, all right, we've got bigger fish to fry. However, some of these applications have a lot of risk, and the sharing of the password can actually multiply the number of actual users. But, for whatever reason, the business has said, we're just going to get one account. Maybe it's because that third-party vendor only allows you to have one account. The typical use case that I think of in this space, because I've run into it a lot myself, is an accounting department that has access to a bank account. So maybe that bank account's a well-known bank, and you can only open one user account to access that bank account. And so they share the password. Now, obviously, the risk of that account seems pretty obvious. But because it's like one account, usually IT won't manage it. I'm wondering, do you see this as well? Do you see this falling into that same scope? And do you have any similar examples?
Yeah, I think it does. Jim, you seem like the kind of guy that cleans your own carpets. Is that right?
Maybe once or twice.
Great. So you probably have been into a store. I think you said you're down in the South. So maybe into a Publix or one of the Albertsons brands to rent a rug doctor. But you probably will be disappointed as an identity professional to find out that most stores share one password for the Rug Doctor rental application amongst the whole store. So that's how that happens. So that's one example. You also tend to think of, federal government, they're pretty secure, right? Purveyors of zero trust. And, how do you do zero trust? Well, hopefully, right, who everybody is. Like that's like one of the first steps in zero trust and what they have access to. But you might be surprised that some pretty critical financial reporting, critical infrastructure reporting, there's some shared passwords there. And that
Yeah, I
scares
mean,
me
when you
too.
think about it, it's just like now my brain is running wild with all the different scenarios. There's probably dozens or hundreds of scenarios like this in a large corporation.
Yeah, I mean, I know of at least 10 corporations that have more than 1,000 of these
There's
examples.
also the apps that kind of sit on the line. So I was mentioning like accounts like bank accounts, utilities, things like that. We know that we started off the conversation talking about social media, and then there's kind of these intermediaries like marketing platforms where again that risk kind of reaches back to um, potential reputation risk where hey, if that system got compromised, forget the tweet that someone could post and all the social media or all the traditional media picks up on it, but you can delete that. What if you send out a million emails? What if that person gets on and sends out a million emails full of content that you don't want sent out to all of your customers? So I think these
Yeah,
third party platforms, I think as IAM practitioners, we need to have a shift in terms of not thinking about their importance just in terms of number of users, but really also understanding what is the risk and including that kind of reputational risk to that big picture.
Jim, what about that mailing application that you probably integrated with your CRM system? And so when the mail spamming system gets hacked, it's got access to everything in your CRM or maybe a lot in your CRM, or think about the cascading risk because all these systems typically are
Right.
connected, right?
So is really the answer then that, in terms of how you should manage this to leverage your IAM platforms like your single sign on, MFA, your IGA platform, or is there more to it than that?
I think I said this before and I'll say it again. My personal belief is any application that is in use for corporate use, even if it's a consumer grade application, in my opinion, should be integrated with single sign on. That's my very strong belief.
And I'll hit you with this one last question. So where does the buck stop? Who's responsible for this? Is it, IT information security, or is it the owners of the applications?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Responsible, right? I mean, I guess, right, the application owner bears responsibility. But I guess I'll ask you, Jim, if there is a breach of credentials, who typically gets fired? Is it the application owner? I don't think so. I mean, in my experience, it's the CISO. It's somebody who works for the CISO. Ultimately, the board holds them responsible for any type of breach. So yeah, I guess, in my opinion, yes, does the responsibility really the application owner? Yes. But I think in terms of who's going to
Yeah,
be in
no,
trouble.
no, I think that's a point well taken. It's interesting as you were saying that, my mind immediately went to, well, we have to know that these applications are in use, that we have these accounts. Some of it, though, is kind of obvious, right? You should know the right questions to ask. Do we have a Twitter? Do we have a Facebook? Do we have a LinkedIn? Do we have marketing platforms? There are all of these things that we need to control. But then you mentioned the rug doctor, utilities, and things like that. So I know there are some technologies that can help you discover what applications are being used. I think you have to bake it into your policies that, if there's even if they're not IT systems that we can control, but if they are accounts that belong to the company, that password sharing is prohibited. If an exception needs to be granted, here's the exception policy. That exception policy will make us aware as information security professionals that there's this password sharing going on. Now it's the ball's in our court, right? We can either, allow the exception because we don't have the resources to address it, or we can address the exception by managing that account. But I think you're right. The buck stops on, if someone goes out to your Twitter account or sends out those million emails, like, who's going to be in trouble? Ultimately, it's probably going to go back to your information security lead.
Well, I think option A is certainly manual compensating controls. And you can sit down and tell your users what that would look like. Or you could say there is an automated way. If you prefer, we can pursue both.
I think there's two things that really struck me about this last kind of back and forth was the importance of an inventory of understanding what are all the assets that we need to protect. And then two, what is the role of the IAM program or information security or whatever the name of the department is that's supposed to be in charge of maybe not necessarily securing it, but providing advice to the organization on what they should be doing to be that, counselor, right, to the internal side of things, that internal consultant that says, hey, we don't own the social media accounts, but here are the things that you need to be thinking about as the owner of those accounts and how you're going to protect the company, from a risk standpoint or whatever it may be. So I think both of those things kind of fundamentally strike to is what type of information security organization or IAM program is in place. Are you consulting on it or, are you kind of more removed from it? I think that's important.
Yeah, Jeff, I think the secure way needs to be the easiest way. I think that's the job of security professionals. Sure, we can educate, but people who are trying to make money in a business are going to take the path of least resistance. So we've got to be creative and make security easy.
I like that. Make security. The easier thing is, the better compliance you'll have. That certainly is definitely a winning strategy. All right, we've waxed poetic here about sort of the importance of security, and now it's time to get, as I like to say, what I've started to say is like it's time to get stupid towards the end, and sort of end on a lighter note. And we usually have a couple of different things, and we let our guests kind of choose. We might go through a couple here, but here's my lighter note for both of you and I will say that this question stems from a conversation that took place on one of my favorites. I don't know if it's really a radio show at this point, but Bennington on Sirius XM. I'm a big fan of those of that show, and they were talking about the way that people put on their socks and shoes. And I was surprised to hear that there was more than one way to do this. And so here's my question for both of you. We'll start with Kurt, and then we'll go to Jim. Is how do you put your socks and shoes on? Is it sock, and then shoe? Or do you do sock, shoe, then the other sock and the other shoe?
Yeah, definitely both socks first and then the shoes. I just feel more accomplished if I get, one thing done and check it off.
Yeah. I mean,
Jim, what about yourself?
I don't think I've ever gone sock, shoe. So I'm with Kurt on that. But I will also tell you that I'm just like everybody else. I put my pants on one leg at a time. But after my pants are on, I make podcasts, gold
podcasts. So I'm the same way. I would say I'm typically a sock, shoe. But one of the interesting wrinkles that I heard was athletes. They tend to do sock, shoe, then sock, and then shoe because they need the exact perfect sort of setup for either stability or safety or just, maybe it's just part of their routine, right? Luck, whatever it may be. And it seemed to be like that was like the one thing that was kind of out there was if you're an athlete, you tend to put your sock and shoe on one side and then do the other one. So I don't know. I guess the next time you're putting your socks and shoes on, you're probably going to be self-conscious about it. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, because I think a lot of people are just kind of on autopilot at that point. All right. So that was one. Let's go to another one. This is one that I've been trying to get in for the last few weeks. And this is a situation that is going to occur to you for the rest of your life. It's going to happen at random times. It may not be severe. It might be annoying, but it is something that you can expect will occur repeatedly over the rest of your life. And that is one of these things is going to happen, and you have to choose. You're going to randomly cough, randomly sneeze, or randomly have a bout of the hiccups. Kurt, what's your poison?
I'm going to have to go with the coughing, and maybe this will get a little bit too personal health-wise, but unfortunately, I already have a little bit of asthma, and so that kind of is my life. So I'm used to it, and I'm still kicking.
It's no big whoop for you. What about you, Jim?
We've almost had to cancel episodes of this podcast due to my hiccuping, right? So I've been waiting for you to use this question too, because that one, I will never pick that one. I'd rather, randomly faint than have the hiccups all the time. I do not like coughing. I've never enjoyed coughing, but sometimes sneezing feels good to me. I mean, I don't know. I'm a little weird, but I have what they call photosynthetic sneezing. Like if I look up at the sun,
or
at a light, I can make myself sneeze. Sometimes I just do it because I feel like sneezing. So I choose sneezing. I'm weird.
Yeah, hiccups are painful. At least they can be. I don't know if I would want that. I guess I would go with the cough because I feel like that's probably something that's more easier to manage for some reason. I don't know. I mean, none of them sound great, so it's really not a way that you want to live. But yeah, I guess I'll go with cough.
Question for you though. So
yes,
with the sneezing, I think you can manage it, but it reminded me of when I was a kid. My dad would carry a handkerchief with him everywhere, and nobody does that anymore, I don't think. But I always thought it was very unsanitary. But I think if I sneezed all the time, I would probably do that because tissues wear out, but those handkerchiefs you could keep on using.
Jim, did you ever see your dad give a crying woman his handkerchief? I've seen that in the movies, and I've always wondered, why will this woman touch this nasty handkerchief?
It's really gross.
From some dude?
No, I never saw my dad do that. What he would do is lick it and then wipe dried ketchup off my face if I got done eating a hot dog or something. And I was like, "Oh, Dad, stop doing that." Anyway, that was the trauma from my childhood.
All right. Well, we don't want to relive that, but yeah, a handkerchief sounds gross, especially if when's the last time it was cleaned. But yeah, way to end on a positive side. Gross, unsanitary handkerchiefs. That's why people listen to the Identity at the Center podcast, is to get that hard hitting content right there. All right, we're going to wrap it up for this week. But before we go, any final thoughts, Kurt, that people should be taking away from this conversation around anything that we talked about? Managing social media accounts, sort of the shared account, delegate account type thing, or will they be, checking out how they're putting their socks and shoes on?
I definitely people should be thinking about the socks and shoes thing. But this is an identity podcast, so I mean, I think we've got to take this seriously. We've got responsibility as professionals for the organizations that we work for, and if there is a solution, then I think we need to be evaluating everything that's out there to make things, like I said, make it easy. If the easy way is the secure way, then it's going to be secure.
Use all the tools in the toolbox. Jim, how about yourself?
So I did a webinar with Mike Engel from One Cosmos last week, and we talked about passwordless, and we talked about MFA being hacked, and we talked about what happened with Uber and Twilio, and today we talked about a couple like Disney and some organizations. And I think what I wanted to point out was that we're not, beating on those companies, right? Nobody's intention is to beat on those companies. What we are tending to do is what can we learn from these situations so that we can be better as IAM practitioners, and how can the industry get better, right? And so it's very unfortunate, I think, that these things happen to our colleagues at other companies, and that they're having to deal with this because, I'm sure they're going through some discomfort. And take the Uber example. I mean, they weren't flagrantly not doing their jobs by any means. They just happened to be the target of this attack. And I think the same thing with the others that we talked about. It's not that they were asleep at the wheel. And even if they were, it's not when somebody's down, like an organization down. We don't want to beat on them. We just want to take away what can we learn from it. What about you, Jeff?
You don't want to be next. I think, it's okay to get smarter. It also reminds me of sort of the old InfoSec adage. There's two types of companies, those that have been breached and those that don't know it yet. So, I think that kind of mindset of always making sure that you're playing, the appropriate level of defense to the risk is important. But yeah, we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week then. You can check us out on the web. We're at identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. I'll have a bunch of show links as well on our brand new listen page that we rolled out a few weeks ago. We joined the 2000s and put search on there. I'll have a link to you, Kurt, on LinkedIn for people who have questions, as along with a link to Cerby, CERBY.com, as well as that social media link. And of course, you can always connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. We always love to engage. And if you've got ideas for future episodes or topics you'd like to see us cover, hit us up on LinkedIn. We're always willing to take that and incorporate that into a show in the future. With that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Appreciate everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.